Allow me to tell you a story about a miniature that was mine, was lost, and was found again. This is the story of my old Imperial Fists dreadnought, which I traded away about 10 years ago, and last year had the chance to reacquire. I'm Matthew, this is Miniscape. Welcome! The miniature I am talking about today is this one. It's the plastic dreadnought that was released in 2008 as part of the Assault on Black Reach starter set for Warhammer 40k 5th edition, along with a small force of Space Marines and Orcs. Back in the day, I painted this as Imperial Fists. As you can see, not particularly well. But to be fair, at this stage, I was coming back into the hobby after a 9-year hiatus. My skills were somewhat lacking, and weren't even that good before the hobby break. I acquired this lad in 2011 when I got my hands on an Assault on Black Reach starter set from eBay for about £20. Some models had been built, but none of them were painted. The captain was missing, but everything else was there. It was an untimely purchase, in some respects, since the 6th edition Dark Vengeance set would be released the following year. However, it was, and I believe still is, a glorious set of miniatures. As an aside, if there's a taste for it amongst the viewers, I would be happy to do a series of videos restoring another Assault on Black Reach set. Let me know in the comments if this is something you would like to see. Before this purchase, I was used to dreadnoughts being metal. I say dreadnoughts, but the only one I had owned up to this point was the metal Furioso Dread from the 3rd edition 40k. Anyway, this plastic one was significantly lighter, and totally unsuitable for smashing windows and fashioning rudimentary melee weapons with your favourite sock. But the detail was impressive for plastic. The plastic one is basically the same size as the metal precursor, though some of the details have slightly different dimensions. Comparing the ranged weapon arm, the melter and power pack are slightly smaller on the plastic version, and there's a nicely sculpted purity seal. The power fist itself is larger, but lacks the exterior power cables on the fingers, or whatever these are called. The sarcophagus is slightly wider, and has a generic Imperial look to it. One side has a skull symbol, because 40k, and one shin guard has a name thing, because see last reason. Spin him around, and you'll see the exhaust pipes are still there, but significantly smaller and almost flush with the back piece. On the metal model, these were separate components you attached to the rear. And speaking of components, the sprue had 7, and these were push-fit so no glue was necessary. The arms were interesting, with these gaps on the inside. I guess it didn't matter since they would be rarely seen. One gap that would be seen was this one on the power fist, due to it being made from 2 parts. I imagine this is probably going to bug some people. It could be filled in, of course, and personally it's a minor issue. These were playing pieces after all, not ornaments, though I guess they could be used as that if you wanted them to be. Despite these minor flaws, an iconic Space Marine unit in push-fit plastic is a beautiful thing, and I was very excited to own one. And here's how the Assault on Black Reach Dread compares to the other plastic dreadnought kit. This one I painted for my Lamenters. The model came on one of these large round bases. The specimen I have here is unpainted, but does have some basing gravel glue to it. I can't remember if I did this, or the previous owner did it, but either way, I allowed it to stay this way, and honestly, it looks fine. The base is a tad wobbly though, warped somewhat, and for that reason, it'll need to be replaced. One feature I added here was magnetization of the multi-melter arm. Nothing fancy, just replacing some plastic on both sides with a neodymium magnet. At the time, I wanted to use this spare las cannon arm as an alternative UC, and I liked the idea of movable arms, like they were some kind of action figure. So, it's a fine gaming piece, bought by me, painted by me, and traded away about 10 years ago, along with the rest of my Imperial Fists collection at the time. At the time, I was disillusioned with Warhammer, fed up with the relentless release schedule and FOMO culture. I guess not much has changed, but I have, having settled into my old Warhammer groove. And now this humble model has found his way back to me, in pretty much the same condition he left me. And he deserves a new paint job, and a new family, with my Imperial Fist Supremacy Force. The first job in tarting up the dreadnought is to separate the model from the base, because he needs a new one. One foot was glued on like a mother flipper, and I had to cut the base to separate it, but it's fine, just a little hurdle. Removing the aberrant foot led to a break, but it was easily glued back on. I rubbed the foot on some sandpaper to remove the excess plastic from the base. Wouldn't want him with one leg longer than the other, would I? After some mould line cleaning, I drilled the barrels on the multi-melter and stone bolter under his power fist. And here's an unpopular opinion. I didn't strip him. I just slapped the paint on top, because 28-year-old me may have been a worse painter, but he still used thin coats. Thanks, Past Matthew. So my new paint isn't going to obscure any significant details. The first step is to use army painter gunmetal to tidy up the legs and mechanical groin, and all that area which surrounds. It was a tad patchy before, you see, and I wanted to get the metallics done before I cracked on with the more challenging yellow. When all that was dry, I cracked open the old Agrax Earthshade and washed it liberally over the metallic parts, like I was painting one of my French girls. Of course, I wicked up any excess with my brush. If I do ever use washes on metal, I find Agrax is better than Nuln, especially for mechanical parts, which would be greasy and grimy in this context. In hindsight, I might have wasted some time here, since I did need to go back and touch up some metallics. However, I still think it was worth it due to the complementary layers of paint that I built up. Next is the orange layer. I took Vallejo Orange Red, somewhat thinned, and slopped it over most of the yellow armour. This is the first stage in the yellow technique I used on my other Imperial Fists, and I think it worked well. The idea is to pre-shade the lower sections with orange before a glaze of Imperial Fists contrast later. In the meantime, I took a fresh 65mm base and stuck on some sand. When the orange was dry, I dry brushed the armour with Vallejo Dark Sand, leaving some of the orange showing. However, in some places, my roughshod brushing covered more orange than I wanted, but it was no bother. I just had to add a little extra orange as a glaze later. It's an accident I'll happily fix, since I don't always stick to the plan, but I go where the brush takes me. Imperial Fist Contrast is the next coat. This goes on every part of the armour for now. Any pools of paint are wicked away with my brush. Some of this, and the last two paints, went on the metallics, but it was fine. I fixed that later on. Next, I wanted to build up some gradient from the orange to yellow, so I did some forbidden mixing, which the Warhammer store guy warned me against, mixing regular acrylic orange with contrast yellow, and strangely enough, the universe didn't explode. Anyway, this went on the lower areas to bring back some shading I stupidly covered, and for the shading that was already there, it gave a useful transition between the yellow and the orange. Then I took some of this flickering orange from Warpaint's Fanatic I recently bought, and added it to soften the transition here and there, since it was a similar colour to the base coat I had achieved. The base got a coat of white prime, and then some Army Painter Goblin Green. Some milliput was used to fill in a few gaps, which I definitely should have done earlier. As you can tell, I am far from professional, and make this up as I go along. The sarcophagus front got a nice thin coat of dark vermilion by Vallejo, which is quite a saturated red, a colour I definitely wanted to have on this model to tone up the warmth. And he does have a warm heart, even if the Marine inside is barely alive. His red also goes on the multi-melter for the same reason, the muzzle and the power unit alike. Next, I took some Citadel Flashkits yellow, thinned it with some flow improver, and glazed it on the armour, on the side opposite the orange, to add to the gradient. It looks quite stark on the footage here, but I thinned it some more to give a more subtle transition, an effect you will notice later, hopefully. Back to the base. I get some Vallejo dark sand on my makeup brush and dry brushed it over the textured parts, followed by a light dusting of Flashkid's yellow again. With the base done, it was time to get this fellow on there. I drilled a hole in his leg that had lost a foot and inserted a short length of paperclip to act as a pin and improve stability. However, I didn't attach it yet while I left the superglue to set around the pin. On the sarcophagus, I painted the background black. Nothing fancy here, but the black was thinned so it could seep into the details. While this black was to hand, I painted the furniture of the underslung stone bolter that colour as well. As you can see from this shot, he's on his base now. I simply glued the feet into the correct place with superglue, and lined up the aberrant foot with the pin. It was fiddly, so I retained my shreds of dignity by doing it off camera. Here you can see me highlighting the edges of the armour with Vallejo dark sand. And there were many edges to highlight. Time, patience, and a steady hand were my trusty companions here. Switching to a smaller brush, I applied dark sand to the twiddly bits around the scroll on the front of the panel. Here I am using Citadel Contrast Skeleton Horde as a wash to give some shading around various details such as skulls, scrolls, and armour recesses. And here's one of my favourite paints of all time, Umbrol 251, a brown of browns if ever there was one. This goes on the metallic areas. This is what I meant earlier about perhaps wasting my time on these areas. To be fair, I didn't paint over every silver area, just those where other colours had splashed over. The reason for this step is to add some variety to the paint job, and because real metals are rarely polished to a bright lustre. Steel, for instance, is often rough and a mixture of brown where it has oxidised. But, metallurgy aside, I think it looks cool this way. While this brown is to hand, I sponge some onto the feet and shin and a few other parts of the armour where I feel it should be chipped. Later, I will add some gunmetal to this to make it look like battle damage, rather than the dirt it appears to be at this stage. There, some on the fist as well. Now I wanted to do something fancier on this shin, so bear with me. I painted it white first, and came back to it later. The winged skull on the sarcophagus got a coat of wolf grey by Warpaint's Fanatic. This is the base coat before I add some white to pick out the feathers. Here, I am using some light orange highlights on the edge of the red areas. The orange is just Vallejo orange red and dark sand mixed together. I apply this to the rivets too. The order of my steps seems a bit chaotic, but that's only because I am moving on to a new area while another one dries. Back to the white shin. I begin a checker pattern by first painting vertical lines, then horizontal lines, aiming for squares as much as possible. But they don't have to be perfect. And there we go, definitely giving out tea towel vibes here. So let's fill in alternating squares with thinned dark vermilion. A bit of patience, and there we go. A cool pattern to give this model some individuality. As I said before, I painted white highlights on the front winged skull. Again, this was fiddly, so I did it off camera. These pipes were painted brown first, but here I am giving them a coat of wolf grey on the ridges. This is done on the other pipes too, such as these on the multi-melter. With this paint to hand, I go to town with it on some other metal areas, to make them look a bit less uniform. Then I get a lighter grey, Fenrisian by Citadel, and highlight all the areas I just did with wolf grey. To call it non-metallic metal is a stretch, but I like the look of it, and it still looks fine even when it's not too neat. My orc models can certainly testify to that. To the same end, I get some more Fenrisian grey and dab it here and there on the metallic parts. 3 feet away, it's going to look fine. Here I am using Citadel Warpstone Glow as the base coat on the wax part of the Purity seal. Now on to some more weathering. With a fine brush and Army Painter gunmetal, I colour in some of the brown areas. The idea being that it looks like paint has chipped off. Some of the brown is left at the fringes, so the exposed metal looks corroded. With more warpstone glow, I paint the smooth cables going towards the sarcophagus. I also apply this to the sensor lenses, which are on the multi-melter arm, and to these parts on the left and right of the sarcophagus. Time for some decals. A couple of Imperial Fist symbols first, and this text which just says Justice, and a Roman numeral 2. The Justice text is just the right size for this name plaque on the shin, so that's what I'm going to use it for. I use scissors to trim these circles as close to the edge as possible, and then douse them all with water. I use a small brush to position them on areas I have varnished with gloss. The green cables get a bit of highlighting with this bright green paint, an oldie called Scorpion Green, which I had a load of fun with last week painting some Eldar striking scorpions. A mix of the two greens I have used goes on the bottom third of those lenses, followed by a thinner line of Scorpion Green, and lastly a dot of white in the opposite quadrant. The final step with these was some gloss varnish. And he's almost done, but I wanted to add some icing on the cake, so I smashed together this banner from a few bits in my bits box, and some steel wire for the pole. The base coat was yellow, followed by red for the back and the rim on the front. While that dried, I painted some brown lines on the Dread's armour, and then added parallel lines to each of them with dark sand. This gives the impression of scratches in the paintwork, and breaks up the large flat areas. On the front of the banner, I painted 2 black quarters, and the banner top also got some black. As you can see, I made the yellow match the armour, and added some red checks to the other quarters. 2 shield symbols are painted on the bottom parts, while the top is dry brushed grey. Finally, some decals were added, and I free-handed a wreath around the fist symbol in the middle. After a couple of days of intensive work, I've given this old Dread the spit polish he deserves. A green base to fit in with my existing fist's force, and a banner for just because. It's an imperfect paint job on an imperfect mini, but is unique now, and is mine. At the time of recording, I didn't fully paint the las cannon arm, but the option is there if I want it in the future. I have been told the chances are slim of finding one's own model for sale on the internet. After so many years, that is. Perhaps it was destiny. Or maybe I just rolled a bunch of 6s. Regardless, having the model again, repainted, is a joyful moment. It's an old model, not the fanciest for sure, and lacking the imposition of newer, larger, better sculpted dreadnoughts. But I shall keep my old models, thank you very much. This one has a story. I wonder what tales he can tell. Did he see any battles? Or did he languish in a box for a decade? I'd love to know, but that is secondary. All that matters is that he is home once again. I recall that years ago I made a trade, and though I had a need it clear out, I lost the one this song's about. The years they passed, I found myself downcast, but fortune smiled and gifted me a golden opportunity to buy that model back again and bring him home again, home again, home again, my dreadnought's home again. He journeyed wide, he travelled far, my plastic yellow superstar, home again, home again. I hate myself for losing him. Parted with him I never should, but now he's back for good. And with that, I better go paint some more minis. Take care, and thanks for watching.